Is time running out to rescue the Jcpoa? Washington warns Tehran to change course or face consequences. So could it be up to the EU to revive the accord? I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's newsmaker is the EU's attempt to salvage the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal is divisive. Donald Trump abandoned the accord after becoming president. Joe Biden campaigned to bring it back. But so far, the commander-in-chief hasn't made much progress, and a meeting between the U.S., Israel, and the UAE may have set him back even further. From the very beginning, Israel opposed the deal, and during Wednesday's visit to the White House, Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid reiterated his reservations and warned his country wasn't afraid to use force if necessary.
There are moments when nations must use force to protect the world from evil. If a terror regime is going to acquire a nuclear weapon, we must act. We must make clear that the civilized world won't allow it. If the Iranians don't believe the world is serious about stopping them, they'll race to the bomb. Israel reserves the right to act at any given moment in any way. That is not only our right, it is also our responsibility. Iran has publicly stated it wants to wipe us out. We have no intention of letting this happen.
Tough talk, but it's what we've come to expect from Israel when it comes to Iran. Washington, however, says it's still keen on salvaging the Jcpoa, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken hinted the U.S. is running out of patience and that it's open to using force if Tehran doesn't change its ways.
We would like to see a mutual return to compliance with the Jcpoa, but Iran's responses, or rather lack thereof, have not been encouraging. And so we are watching Iran's comments, posture, very, very carefully. And as the minister said, we are prepared to turn to other options if Iran doesn't change course.
Well, for now, Iran doesn't necessarily seem interested in changing course. Soon after the U.S. and Israel had spoken, Tehran decided to test its anti-missile defense system. General Amir Qadir Rahimzadeh hailed the operation as a success and said Iran was perfectly prepared to protect sensitive and vital installations. Seeing missiles launched is a concern, but some are obviously more worried about Iran building a nuclear bomb. It's always denied that it wants one, and Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei even declared it's religiously forbidden. But after Trump pulled out of the Jcpoa in 2018, Iran started enriching uranium at levels far beyond what was banned under the agreement. The chance of reviving the nuclear deal is now hanging by a thread, but the EU might be taking it upon itself to save it. At the end of September, the bloc's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, was convinced talks would resume soon.
But I've been talking with the Foreign Affairs Minister of Iran, the new Foreign Affairs Minister in Iran, and when he told me soon, I understand soon on a measure of time which is according with the request of the other members of the board of the Jcpoa. As coordinator of these talks, I am convinced that the talks will resume in a time lag that will be acceptable for everybody.
Now, the EU's Iran envoy and Deputy Secretary General Enrique Mora has traveled to Tehran to discuss the accord, talking face-to-face with Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister. So is there real scope for progress if the EU takes the lead? Joining me now from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi, a political analyst and professor at Tehran University. From London, Paul Ingram, an expert on nuclear disarmament and the director of Emergent Change. And from Washington is Annelle Sheline, a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute. Thanks all so much for being with me. Mohammad, I'm going to start with you. First, if you can just actually clarify why Enrique Mora met with Ali Bagheri instead of the foreign minister himself. Was there an issue there?
I don't know. I'm sure there's an issue of protocol. But what is important for the Iranians is that the EU recognize that they are violating international law by imposing maximum pressure sanctions on Iran alongside the United States. They are murdering ordinary Iranians. They are targeting women and children. There's no ambiguity about this. They've been doing it for years under Trump, and they continue to do so under Biden. They were the side that violated the agreement when the Iranians were abiding by it, and they have to make up for the harm that they've done to Iranians, and they have to go back and fulfill the agreement in full if they want the Iranians to return to the agreement.
Well, fair enough. The question was really, I mean, you say it's about the protocol. Some people were questioning why they wouldn't actually bring in the foreign minister to meet with the EU, considering how very important these steps are to try and get the agreement back online. Annelle, let me turn to you. The EU was, many would argue, somewhat powerless while Trump was in office. But with Biden, do you think now they can take the lead, knowing his administration would not at least block their efforts the way Trump did?
I mean, unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of continuity between the Biden administration from the Trump administration. In particular, recently, perhaps we'll get to this, the fact that the U.S. is meeting with the UAE and Israel seems to signal their interest in demonstrating that the U.S. is still involved in the region. Whereas when the U.S. was starting to take more of a back page, that was when we started to see more diplomacy breaking out between the members of the GCC and Iran. So I think it's really quite unfortunate the way that the U.S. is trying to sort of keep things the way they were in terms of more antagonism, especially, we know Israel maintains its concerns about Iran and is not interested in any sort of a detente or reduction of tensions. But I just think it's truly unfortunate that the U.S. is feeding into that rather than welcoming the fact that across the region we've seen more of a reduction of tensions, especially between members of the GCC and Iran.
Okay, let me ask Paul. I mean, speaking of the U.S. and Israel, should we be worried to hear that they are now considering what they call a Plan B that doesn't rule out the use of force if they determine that Iran is not operating in good faith according to the agreement that we admit the United States violated in principle?
Well, I would just point out that we are rapidly approaching the 20th anniversary in the next year or two of the crisis hitting in the first place, and we have been here so many times before. To answer your previous question, the EU cannot operate without the United States. They attempted to do so in the very early stages, almost 20 years ago, and the Iranians weren't interested because the Americans and the regional allies there hold the key. The EU can attempt to play some kind of a mediating role, but all the while the Biden administration holds the threat of force in the back pocket. I think that simply ups the ante, and you have responses like you've seen on this program already, that Iran is ready for a fight, and that's not helpful on either side to achieving a deal which is in the interests of everyone.
But Paul, really, you don't think the EU can do anything more, given that the Biden administration has said it wants to relaunch the Jcpoa in full? This is not the Trump administration in office with all its aggressive behavior that would have gone out of its way to make sure the EU could not in any way negotiate with Iran against what the U.S. saw as its own interests. There's nothing different now? Go ahead.
Yeah, so the European Union has successfully kept the Jcpoa alive on life support. If it weren't for the EU, we would not be talking about it today. But it cannot keep the deal on life support forever. That requires the Biden administration. The administration has already lost its window of opportunity that it had in the first few weeks of its administration back in January and February, when it really should have just rejoined the deal without conditions. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that for political and institutional reasons, the Biden administration has sought to leverage more out of the Iranians than they originally agreed to in the deal, and that has led to the situation we're in today. Both sides are entrenched. I don't see any significant ray of light of hope. I'm a hopeful person. I've tried to talk up hope in the past, but right now, today, it's very difficult to see it. Without some significant shift in Washington, from my perspective as somebody who's relatively independent, the ball is in Washington's court today.
You know, Mohammad, you have said before that the maximum pressure campaign has already been maximized. Has it really? You don't think there's anything else the U.S. can do to further pressure Iran, and that the worst really has passed?
No, I don't think the Americans can do much more unless they want to initiate some sort of military conflict. But after what we saw in Afghanistan, I think it's quite clear to everyone that the United States does not have the stomach to go to war with Iran. It's not a war that it can win. Iran has powerful allies across the region. Its missile defense capabilities, its drone defense capabilities are second to none in the region. So I think that the problem really lies in the fact that, A, the European Union is powerless, and that really raises the question whether they should even be at the negotiating table if they're so irrelevant. And B, the United States does not have the will to go back to the nuclear deal for reasons that I think were alluded to by your previous guest. So if the United States cannot go back to the nuclear deal, the Iranians are not going to go back to the nuclear deal. The situation today is actually much more better for Iran than it is for the United States compared to 6 years ago when the deal was first signed. The United States is on the retreat in the region. It has internal crises to deal with. It has to deal with China, and the Iranians have gone through the worst, and Iranian allies across the region are stronger today than they were before. So for the Americans to come and say we want to keep some of the sanctions that were added after the deal, or for Iran to give new concessions, is a joke to Iranians.
Mohammad, you've also said that Iran can be rather confident at this point that in a sense it has the upper hand because there's also oil to use as leverage. How does that work?
Yes, because the price of oil right now is going up. It's gone above $80 a barrel. The global economy is doing very bad, and the price of oil will probably go higher. And any crisis in this region or beyond could trigger a rapid rise in the price of oil. So for example, right now in Iraq, the uncertainty that we see in that country, if it leads to instability and a decrease in Iraqi oil exports, then that will send oil prices through the roof.
Okay.
How is the United States going to try to marginalize Iran when oil prices are so high and when the threat of instability exists? Buyers of Iranian oil, as they are already ignoring the United States, will not only continue to ignore them, but they'll be asking for more Iranian oil.
Okay. Annelle, I want to get your thoughts on that and ask you as well, you know, if the U.S., if Mohammad is right that the U.S. would never really want to use force because it doesn't want to be involved in any other sort of military action, especially in the Middle East, if not by force, what are the other means at the U.S. disposal to put pressure on Iran?
Well, we see the U.S. right now, as I was saying, reaching out to the UAE and to Israel, trying to again signal that the U.S. is still involved in the region, is still trying to throw its weight around in a way that it's sort of accustomed to doing. But I really don't think there's much more to be done. As my colleague was saying, the maximum pressure has already maximized, and Iran has actually reduced its dependence on oil, is reaching out to China. And increasingly, we see not only Iran, but other countries finding ways to get around U.S. sanctions, to get off the U.S. dollar. So the more the U.S. tries to act in ways that signal that it is still sort of the unipolar, most powerful actor in the global order, simply undermines American power because it pushes other countries to move away from the sort of American-led system, which again is so contrary to what the U.S. had originally said it wanted, which is to bring other countries in, to try to encourage diplomacy. I mean, in general, it's really just demonstrating some of the hypocrisy that lies underneath a lot of American policy, which claims to want to push for peace and global integration, but instead is really just a sort of dressed up version of trying to maintain American primacy.
And now, let me ask you this as well. I mean, is this not ruling out force line? Is it perhaps a subtle way to kind of green light more Israeli covert action in Iran, be it via assassinations or targeted attacks?
Yes, I think so. I think the concern right now for the UAE, they're probably feeling a bit worried that they've signed these Abraham Accords, which theoretically Israel might be trying to push for, perhaps trying to launch something from the UAE, being that much closer to Iran. And the UAE doesn't want to be caught in the middle here. I think they entered the Abraham Accords because the Trump administration demonstrated that they were going to get F-35s out of the deal. This was a nice way for them to signal their utility as a key security partner of the United States. But they may be realizing now what they've gotten themselves into, which is involvement in this deeply anti-Iran coalition. And if things do start to get violent, the UAE will be caught in the middle.
Mohammad, I want to come back to you about that, because should Iran at all be worried that, you know, the United States is, as I said, subtly giving Israel the green light to carry out more covert action that is highly destabilizing to Iran, the targeted attacks and the assassinations?
Well, I think that if anyone looks at the map, they'll see that the Israelis don't really have much of an advantage. Much of Israeli trade goes eastwards and passes by Iran, whereas most of Iranian trade goes eastward as well, and very little passes by Israel. So Israeli ships could easily be targeted. And Iran's missile and drone defense capabilities, as I said, are very extensive. And Iran's allies surround the Israeli regime. So I don't think it's really in the interests of the regime to be provocative towards Iran. Iran has shown recently that it's going to respond aggressively against any Israeli provocation. We've seen cases of that. So no, I don't think Iran takes that seriously. In fact, what the Israelis do is they give the Iranians an opportunity, a legitimate opportunity, to punish them. And also, I think an important point that we have to keep in mind is that the Israelis, when they establish very good ties with regimes in this region, whether it's the UAE or whether it's Azerbaijan or anyone, in the long term, it actually delegitimizes those states, those governments, those regimes, because nowhere in this region do people like the Israelis. They see them as colonizers, they see it as an apartheid regime, they see them murdering Palestinians on a daily basis. So while the Israelis may think that they've gained a foothold in country A, B, or C, in reality, they're only, in the long term, delegitimizing, in the eyes of the public, their allies.
Okay, Annelle, I'm just going to come back to you for 1 second. I saw you nodding in agreement with some of the things you heard said, but I want to ask you if you really believe that aggressive response that Mohammad was talking about, that Iran is not scared of making, does it really work in Iran's interest when it exercises that aggressive response mode?
I mean, in general, I think aggression doesn't tend to work well. You know, things get out of hand, conflicts go much longer than anticipated, the damage and the cost is often much, much higher. But unfortunately, the way that the U.S. and Israel are behaving towards Iran, it wouldn't be surprising if Iran felt that its only option is really to demonstrate that, hey, if you push us, we are going to push back. My hope is that perhaps, you know, Biden has said a lot about wanting to reach back out to the EU. It was said earlier that the EU is really irrelevant here, but Biden would really look like a hypocrite if he goes directly against what his partners in the EU are saying. So I do think there's a certain question of Biden's credibility here as trying to distinguish himself from Trump, trying to reestablish ties with these key allies in Europe. And so perhaps there is a way here for Biden to stick to his campaign promise of getting back into the Iran nuclear deal.
Okay, Paul, I saw you had a comment. Go ahead.
Sure. I just don't want to lose sight in all of this of the effects on real people, because whilst the Iranians may be in a reasonably strong strategic position, they talk a lot about the resistance economy and the ability to stand on their own 2 feet. But you know, they have very high unemployment rates. The middle classes has shrunk dramatically since 2016. We've got rampant inflation and a number of protests. Now, I'm of the opinion that all of that feeds into a stronger government, which we've seen in the elections in the summer, because the reform movement has been completely discredited by the actions of Trump and then of Biden's inability to act before the election to rejoin the JCPOA. So I think a lot of the blame lies with the United States, but Iran is not as strong as some may believe when it comes to the economy and the people. And this is not going to result in any revolution, counter-revolution, or some friendly regime to the United States, as some in Washington may dream. But it will make things worse, but it'll be bad for the Iranian people. And we should not forget the impact on them and on people in the region.
Right. They are under pressure as we speak, even before this escalates even further, if it does. But, Paul, I need to change tact with you a bit and ask, because Israel repeats this line regularly in the genuine belief that it is being threatened, its very existence is threatened entirely by Iran, and that this nuclear program of Iran's does have the full intention of building nuclear weapons that could eliminate the state of Israel if it went that far. I have to ask you, are you genuinely worried about what Iran could do with its nuclear program if the JCPOA is not revived?
So I think there are many legitimate interpretations of what Iran may or may not be doing with their nuclear program. I think there are very strong, legitimate reasons for thinking that Iran is busy demonstrating its ability in the face of such major opposition around the world to show that it can develop technology that is relevant to the 21st century in its eyes. I personally think nuclear power is irrelevant to the future of this planet, but that's my opinion, and not the opinion of many people. I think what we see here is a very dangerous game being played, where the Iranians know very well that this creates a lot of concern and problems around the world. But it also very successfully highlights the hypocrisy when countries like my own and others deploy nuclear weapons, and then you have presidents like President Trump brazenly threatening the use of nuclear weapons in deeply irresponsible ways. So I think we have to be very cautious about assuming that the moment Iran acquires a nuclear weapon capability, they will then deploy nuclear weapons and then threaten to wipe Israel off the map, which incidentally itself was a misinterpretation of a speech by Ahmadinejad a number of years ago, which failed to actually put it in context. Ahmadinejad has never threatened to use nuclear weapons against Israel, and I think it quite highly likely that the Iranians, who are no more irresponsible in this area than any other leadership, should they acquire nuclear weapons, would use them immediately. They would use them as a strategic deterrent. But I don't sleep well at night knowing that that's a possibility, because I don't trust any of these leaderships that brandish nuclear weapons.
Mohammad, I want to get your response, but first let me get to Annelle, because I saw you had a comment earlier on. Go ahead.
Well, it's important to remember that Israel has nuclear weapons, even though they are not officially declared. So at this point, especially in America, there tends to be a perception that Iran already has nukes or is intending to develop nuclear weapons, and Israel doesn't. And it's the complete opposite, that Israel already possesses these weapons. And I mean, the unfortunate thing, I think, is that if Iran is pushed to a place where it does acquire a nuclear weapon, then we're going to see all the other big Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, insisting on nukes.
Yeah, Mohammad, very quickly, just final seconds. Go ahead and your final thoughts.
Yes, the Iranians have said repeatedly if they had wanted to produce nuclear weapons, they would have been able to do so many years ago. And the fact that they haven't shows that Iran has no intention to do so. I would, though, give an example of where Western countries, Europeans, the Americans, gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, the military intelligence to use them, and the political cover to get away with it. But the Iranians refused to respond with their own chemical weapons, and the Iranian leaders said that it is forbidden according to their ideology. So history has shown that Western countries have used weapons of mass destruction against Iran through Saddam, and history has shown that Iran has refrained from using those very same weapons themselves. So I think that as the Israeli regime has nuclear weapons, I think Iran is much more trustworthy.
Mohammad Marandi, Paul Ingram, Annelle Sheline, thank you so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sanke. We'll see you next time.